What we see in the Orthodox world is a very stable tradition that has been maintained with a great deal of consistency over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. What's novel in our current context is the waves of immigrants that have come to the United States from Orthodox countries, and their attempt to find a way to be both American and Orthodox, and modern challenges that are facing Orthodox Christians with respect to their visual heritage, like reproduction. Ever since the printing press was invented, there's been an ongoing discussion within the Orthodox Church of whether printed icons are acceptable or whether there should be painted icons. And this is a discourse that just bubbles along under the surface. It doesn't create explosions or huge disruptions, but it is an issue that people do think about. As more and more American Christians become aware of orthodoxy at large and become curious about icons, a new modern question that has intensified is, what does it mean for non-Orthodox to be painting icons? There are lots of stories about how painting an icon converts people to Orthodoxy, to Christianity, and then to its particular form of Orthodoxy. Or whether this is problematic because people don't truly understand the depth of the tradition, the purpose of the icon, and the theology of the icon. That generated a document called Environment and Art in Catholic Worship, was published in 1978, and that has really shaped the context here in the United States for very careful, thoughtful work with the visual arts on a case-by-case basis. So all of that is a background for the willy-nilly experimentation that's going on in Protestant churches, where there's very little there are very few internal tools that have come up in the Protestant tradition to help us adjudicate appropriate, inappropriate, helpful, and unhelpful use of images. So what I conclude has happened is that most of our artists who are Protestant Christians have received their fundamental formation in thinking about themselves as artists in school. That's no surprise. But there are different kinds of schools and different kinds of training. You can be trained as an architect, you can be trained as a graphic designer, you can be trained as an art educator, you can be trained as an MFA. Each of those have slightly different assumptions about what art is for, the relationship between the artwork and the audience, the status of the artist, that come into church when those artists come into church. And there's no internal toolkit in the church to take all of these assumptions and all of these commitments that essentially originate in our school systems and figure out how to integrate them healthily with the life of the church. So here's an example of how Protestants are not always really good at paying attention to the visual component of their worship that goes beyond just the images. But the images direct where we look and how we look. So I was doing adult Sunday school at a church in Santa Barbara and attended worship before the Sunday school class was supposed to start. This church had recently introduced screens and a projector into its worship space, and they were still figuring out how this worked. And they were using it for the conventional purposes that most churches do, to project lyrics and parts of a sermon outline. But the Sunday I was there, they were celebrating communion. So they had the form, the litany, up on the screen, but the pastor didn't have his own copy of the litany. And he ended up turning around and facing the front wall of the church with his back to the congregation and raising the bread and raising the wine and speaking the words of institution. And it looked, for all the world, like a pre-Vatican II Catholic Eucharist. And I thought, this is probably not what this church intends. In fact, I know it's not what this church intends. One of the things that I personally find very striking when I ask people to tell me about their experiences, older people to tell me about their experiences growing up in their church, and then what happens in their churches now with the visual, is the interest in the hospitality. There are lots of concerns about quality and about reverence. So when things are facilitated by pictures that strike some of these mature Christians as not quite decorous or respectful enough for the church, I find that interesting but not unusual. What I find fascinating is how the worry about idolatry and the abuse of images has completely evaporated. I never hear people expressing that concern, which is the historic concern of Protestant churches through the centuries. And when you talk in an abstract manner about images in worship, that concern will be named as the problem, why we don't do this. But what's interesting is we've started to do it all the time, and it appears to me that we are no longer deeply concerned about mistaking images for gods or becoming overly attached to images as they facilitate our worship. So there are a number of concerns, but I would put them second, third level concerns of how do we do this well, how do we do this appropriately, than whether we should be doing it at all.